The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. It wasn't just another day. This case had attracted attention from every corner of the city. The plaintiff, a small business owner struggling to hold on to his family legacy, was up against a powerful corporate giant known for crushing its competition. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone in the room seemed to sense that this trial was more than just a legal battle. At the center of it all was Judge Clarence Wilkins, known for his stern demeanor and sharp tongue. He was a man who valued tradition and hierarchy. He liked to believe he could size people up the moment they walked into his courtroom. So when the young attorney representing the small business stepped forward, he barely masked his disinterest. She was black, young, and unfamiliar to him, a combination he quickly dismissed as insignificant. The attorney, Amara Daniels, didn't flinch under the weight of the judge's cold stare. She moved with quiet confidence, her tailored suit crisp, her every step purposeful. To those who didn't know her, she might have seemed calm, almost too calm for someone about to take on such a high-stakes case. But those who did know her understood that Amara had always carried herself this way. She had no time to waste on appearances. She was there to fight for her client. And nothing else mattered. The judge called the courtroom to order, his gavel echoing sharply through the room. "Ms. Daniels, you may proceed," he said, his tone carrying a faint edge of impatience. Amara nodded, walking to the center of the courtroom. All eyes were on her, and for a brief moment the room fell silent. Then, with a steady voice, she began her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we stand here to address an injustice. My client, Mr. Luis Ramirez, has poured his heart and soul into his small business. For decades, his family has served this community, building relationships and trust. But now he finds himself under attack by a corporation that sees his livelihood as nothing more than a target for profit. This case is not just about contracts or finances. It's about fairness, about the value of hard work, and about standing up to those who believe they are too powerful to be challenged." Her words were clear and measured, but they carried an undeniable weight. Even those who had entered the courtroom skeptical of her ability found themselves leaning forward, drawn in by her passion and precision. Judge Wilkins, however, remained unimpressed. He tapped his pen against the desk, a subtle but deliberate signal that he was ready for her to move on. "Ms. Daniels, I trust you'll stick to the facts of the case," he interjected, his tone dripping with condescension. Amara paused for a fraction of a second, then met his gaze with unwavering calm. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied smoothly, continuing without missing a beat. As the day unfolded, it became clear that Amara had come prepared. She questioned witnesses with razor-sharp focus, her questions cutting straight to the heart of the matter. She presented evidence that was not only thorough but also compelling, painting a vivid picture of the harm done to her client. Despite her skill, Judge Wilkins seemed determined to find fault. He interrupted her frequently, questioning her methods and pushing back on her arguments. His tone was always polite enough to avoid outright accusations of bias, but the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Still, Amara didn't let it rattle her. Each time the judge tried to trip her up, she responded with a calm, thoughtful answer that left no room for doubt. The jury began to take notice. So did the spectators in the gallery, some of whom exchanged knowing glances every time Amara outmaneuvered the judge's attempts to undermine her. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere had shifted. Amara had proven herself to be more than capable, but the judge's attitude loomed like a storm cloud over the proceedings. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread among those who had witnessed the day's events. "She's good," someone murmured. "Really good, but does the judge have it out for her?" Amara ignored the chatter as she packed up her materials. She knew what they were saying, and she knew the road ahead would be challenging. But she had faced worse before. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. As she left the courtroom, her client, Mr. Ramirez, approached her, his face filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Daniels," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, I'm glad you're fighting for me." Amara offered him a small smile. "We're not done yet, Mr. Ramirez. Not even close." And with that, she stepped into the evening air, the weight of the day still heavy on her shoulders. But her resolve was unshaken. She wasn't just here to win a case. She was here to prove that justice didn't belong to the powerful. It belonged to those willing to fight for it. The courtroom came alive again the next morning as everyone prepared for another tense session. The case had already drawn a crowd, and word of the young attorney's sharp performance had spread. Journalists, law students, and curious spectators filled the gallery, eager to see how Amara Daniels would handle the second day of the trial. Judge Clarence Wilkins took his seat, his expression stern as usual. He scanned the room and then settled his gaze on Amara. She sat at the plaintiff's table, flipping through her notes with a calm focus that seemed unshakable. If she felt the pressure of the growing audience or the judge's obvious skepticism, she didn't show it. "Court is now in session," Judge Wilkins announced, his voice booming. The jurors took their seats, and the opposing counsel, a slick, well-dressed man named Martin Cross, leaned back confidently in his chair. Cross was a seasoned corporate lawyer who had built a reputation for his ruthless strategies. He had underestimated Amara on the first day, but now he watched her carefully, his smile tight. The first witness of the day was an executive from the corporation, a man with a polished demeanor and rehearsed answers. Cross began with his questions, guiding the witness through a series of points that painted the corporation as a victim of unfortunate circumstances. The executive spoke with ease, his tone calm and professional. When it was Amara's turn, she rose with quiet confidence. Walking to the witness stand, she carried a stack of documents, each one meticulously prepared. "Mr. Langford," she began, her voice steady but firm, "you mentioned that your company only acted within the terms of the contract. Is that correct?" The executive nodded. "Yes, that's correct." Amara pulled out a sheet of paper and held it up. "And is this the same contract you're referring to?" Langford hesitated for a moment, his polished demeanor faltering slightly. "Yes, that appears to be it." "Good," Amara said, her tone sharp. "Then can you explain why Clause 14.3, which clearly states that any changes must be agreed upon in writing by both parties, was ignored when your company unilaterally raised the fees by 30%? The courtroom grew still. Langford shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, that adjustment was standard in our industry." Amara didn't let up. "Standard, perhaps, but not agreed upon, as required by the contract you just confirmed. Would you call this an oversight, or was it a deliberate action?" Langford fumbled for words, glancing at Cross for support. Cross quickly objected, claiming the question was argumentative. "Overruled," Judge Wilkins said reluctantly, his tone clipped. He looked at Amara, his expression unreadable, but she could sense his irritation. Langford gave a vague answer, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the cracks in the corporation's carefully constructed narrative, and Amara's calm, methodical questioning had left a strong impression. The next witness was a former employee of the corporation, called by Amara. This man, Mr. Harper, had worked for the company for over a decade before being let go under suspicious circumstances. Harper was nervous as he took the stand, clearly uncomfortable being in the spotlight. Amara approached him gently, her tone softer now. "Mr. Harper, thank you for being here today. Can you tell the court about your role at the company?" Harper explained his position, detailing his years of service and the responsibilities he had carried out. He spoke hesitantly at first, but grew more confident as Amara guided him through her questions. "You mentioned in your deposition," Amara said, holding up another document, "that you raised concerns about certain practices within the company. Can you elaborate on what those concerns were?" Harper glanced nervously at the defense table before nodding. "Yes, I noticed that some contracts with smaller businesses were being altered without their knowledge. Fees were being added, deadlines shortened. It didn't seem right." "And did you report these concerns?" Amara asked. "Yes," Harper said, "but my supervisor told me to let it go." Later, I was told my position was being eliminated. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Cross immediately objected, claiming the testimony was speculative and irrelevant. Judge Wilkins hesitated. Sustain. He stopped mid-word, reconsidering as Amara looked at him with calm determination. Actually, I'll allow it for now. Proceed, Ms. Daniels. Thank you, Your Honor, Amara said politely. She turned back to Harper. Mr. Harper, in your opinion, were these practices consistent with the company's stated policies? No, Harper replied firmly. They were not. Amara thanked him and returned to her seat, leaving the courtroom deep in thought. The picture she was painting was becoming clearer. A corporation that used its power to bully smaller businesses while ignoring its own policies. As the day wore on, Amara continued to hold her ground, presenting her case with unwavering focus. Judge Wilkins, however, seemed determined to challenge her at every turn. He interrupted her more than once, questioning her methods and subtly undermining her authority. But Amara didn't rise to the bait. Each time the judge pushed back, she responded with professionalism and precision, her calm demeanor never wavering. The jury took notice, as did the spectators in the gallery. By the time court adjourned, it was clear that Amara had not only held her own, but had begun to shift the tide in her client's favor. The whispers among the audience grew louder as people discussed her performance. As she packed her materials, Amara caught the eye of Martin Cross. He nodded at her, a hint of respect in his expression, but she didn't linger on it. She wasn't here for his approval. Stepping out into the fresh air, Amara felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. The fight was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. She was just getting started. The third day of the trial began with a heightened sense of anticipation. By now, the courtroom had become the center of attention in the legal community. Spectators who had only planned to drop by out of curiosity found themselves returning, eager to see what Amara Daniels would do next. Her calm confidence, coupled with her sharp strategy, had made her the unlikely star of the proceedings. Judge Wilkins entered the courtroom, his face as impassive as ever. Yet beneath his composed exterior, he couldn't ignore the fact that Amara was steadily dismantling the defense's case. The young attorney had turned out to be far more formidable than he had expected. Even so, he didn't let up on his strict approach, continuing to scrutinize her every move. Amara sat at her table, her focus unwavering. She knew that the courtroom dynamics were shifting, but she also knew that momentum could swing just as easily in the opposite direction. She had no room for mistakes. Today's witnesses would be critical to building the final pieces of her argument. The first witness was the plaintiff himself, Mr. Luis Ramirez. He took the stand, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and it showed in the slight tremble of his voice as he answered the initial questions. Amara approached him with care. Mr. Ramirez, she began gently, can you tell the court how long your family has operated Ramirez Market? Almost 40 years, he replied. My parents started it when they came to this country. It's always been a family business. And in those 40 years, Amara continued, what has this market meant to your family? Louis hesitated, emotion flickering across his face. It's been everything, he said softly. It's how we survived, how we sent my brother and me to school. It's our legacy. Amara nodded. And how did you feel when the defendant's company suddenly raised their fees, making it nearly impossible for you to keep your business afloat? Louis took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly. I felt betrayed. We trusted them. They said they wanted to support small businesses, but instead, they were trying to crush us. The courtroom was silent as Louis spoke. Even the jurors, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, seemed moved by his sincerity. Amara continued her questioning, guiding Louis through the timeline of events. She asked him about the impact of the fee increase, how it had forced him to cut back on inventory, how loyal customers had stopped coming because he couldn't compete with larger stores, and how he had nearly lost everything. Cross, the opposing counsel, objected several times, accusing Amara of leading the witness. Judge Wilkins upheld one or two objections, but for the most part, he allowed her to proceed. Even he couldn't ignore the relevance of Lewis's testimony. When Cross had his turn to cross-examine, he wasted no time trying to poke holes in Lewis's story. "Mr. Ramirez," he began smoothly, "isn't it true that the defendant's fee increase was clearly outlined in their updated policy documents?" Lewis frowned, his discomfort evident. "I never saw those documents. They were never sent to me." Cross smirked. "Yet you continued doing business with the company. Doesn't that suggest you accepted their terms?" Before Lewis could answer, Amara stood. "Objection. The question misrepresents the facts. My client has already testified that he was unaware of the fee increase until after it was implemented." Judge Wilkins hesitated, his gaze flicking between Cross and Amara. "Sustained," he said at last, his voice reluctant. Cross leaned back, his expression tightening. He pressed on, but his efforts to undermine Lewis' credibility fell flat. By the time Lewis stepped down from the stand, it was clear that the jury was on his side. The next witness was an expert Amara had called to analyze the financial records of the defendant's company. The expert, a sharp and detail-oriented accountant, methodically broke down the numbers, showing how the fee increases disproportionately affected small businesses like Lewis. Amara guided the expert through a series of questions, ensuring that the jurors understood the complex data. "So, to summarize," she said finally, "these fee increases were not only excessive, but also strategically targeted to force smaller competitors out of the market. Is that correct?" "Yes," the expert replied confidently. Cross tried to counter with his own expert witness, but Amara was ready. When she cross-examined their expert, she exposed several inconsistencies in their analysis, leaving the defense scrambling to recover. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again. Amara's arguments were coming together like pieces of a puzzle, each one reinforcing her central claim, that the defendant's company had deliberately exploited its power to harm small businesses. By the time court adjourned, even Judge Wilkins couldn't completely hide his grudging respect. He still scrutinized her every move, but the tone of his interruptions had softened. Outside the courtroom, the crowd of onlookers had grown. Reporters jotted down notes, and law students discussed Amara's performance in hushed tones. "She's relentless," one of them said. "She doesn't let anything slip past her." Amara stepped into the cool evening air, exhausted but satisfied. She knew there was still work to do, but for the first time, she felt the tide turning firmly in her favor. Lewis approached her, his face filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're fighting harder for my family than I ever imagined anyone would." Amara smiled, her resolve shining through her fatigue. "This isn't just about your family, Mr. Ramirez. It's about fairness. And I'm not stopping until we get it." The fight was far from over, but Amara Daniels wasn't one to back down. She had faced doubters her entire life, and each time, she had proven them wrong. This time would be no different. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as the trial entered its fourth day. The stakes felt higher than ever, and the tension in the room was palpable. Amara Daniels had steadily built a compelling case against the powerful corporation, exposing cracks in their defense that even seasoned courtroom observers couldn't ignore. Amara arrived early, as always, reviewing her notes one last time before the proceedings began. She had spent most of the night refining her strategy, knowing that the upcoming testimonies would be critical. Each step of this trial had been an uphill battle, but she thrived under pressure. Judge Wilkins entered with his usual stern demeanor, his robes sweeping behind him as he took his seat. He cast a glance at Amara, as he had done every morning, but this time his expression lingered. It was subtle, but there was something different. Was it curiosity? Respect? Amara wasn't sure, but she didn't let it distract her. The first witness of the day was a small business owner named Maria Alvarez, who had also been affected by the defendant's fee hikes. Her testimony was crucial in demonstrating that Luis Ramirez's experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation. Maria took the stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Amara approached her with a warm smile, her tone gentle as she began. "Mrs. Alvarez, can you tell the court about your business?" Maria nodded, her voice shaky at first. "I own a bakery, Alvarez Bake Shop. We've been open for 12 years. And during those 12 years, how has your business relationship with the defendant's company changed?" Maria hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. At first, they were supportive. They offered us good terms, and it felt like a partnership. But then, a few years ago, things started to change. They raised their fees without warning, and when I tried to negotiate, they ignored me. Amara leaned in slightly, her voice filled with compassion. "And what impact did those fee increases have on your bakery?" Maria's voice cracked as she answered. "We almost had to close. I couldn't afford to keep up with the fees, and we lost a lot of customers because I had to raise prices. My husband and I had to take out a loan just to stay afloat." The room was silent, the weight of Maria's words hanging heavy in the air. Amara paused for a moment, letting the jury absorb the testimony before continuing. "Mrs. Alvarez, did the defendant's company ever offer you any explanation for these fee increases?" "No," Maria said firmly. "They just sent new invoices. No calls, no meetings, nothing." Cross objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but Judge Wilkins overruled him, his tone sharper than usual. Amara nodded in acknowledgement and pressed on. "Mrs. Alvarez, if you could speak directly to the defendant's executives, what would you say to them?" Maria took a deep breath, her voice steady now. "I'd ask them why they think it's okay to crush small businesses like mine. We're just trying to survive. Don't they understand what they're doing to families like mine?" The jury seemed moved, some of them glancing at the defense table with narrowed eyes. Amara thanked Maria and allowed Cross to begin his cross-examination. Cross was aggressive, as expected, attempting to discredit Maria's testimony by suggesting her financial struggles were due to mismanagement, not the fee increases. But Maria stood her ground, her sincerity and resilience shining through. Amara couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as she watched the jury's reactions. The second half of the day was dedicated to presenting hard evidence, emails, invoices, and internal documents that Amara had uncovered during discovery. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of the corporation's practices. One email, in particular, caused a stir. It was from a senior executive, instructing staff to maximize revenue from small accounts while dismissing complaints as non-issues. Amara held the printed email up for the jury to see. "This," she said, her voice firm and clear, "is the mindset behind the defendant's actions. To them, small businesses like Ramirez Market and Alvarez Bake Shop are just numbers on a spreadsheet. They aren't partners, they're targets." Cross objected again, accusing Amara of grandstanding, but Judge Wilkins allowed her to continue. Amara walked to the jury box, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "This case isn't just about contracts or fees. It's about fairness. It's about accountability. These small business owners trusted this corporation, and that trust was betrayed. The evidence speaks for itself." By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was electric. Spectators whispered among themselves as they filed out of the courtroom, and even the reporters seemed energized by the day's proceedings. Amara gathered her materials, her exhaustion barely concealed. She had spent every ounce of her energy ensuring that today's testimony and evidence left a lasting impression, and it had worked. As she exited the courthouse, a small group of people approached her, other small business owners who had been watching the trial closely. One of them, an elderly man, shook her hand firmly. "You're fighting for all of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Amara smiled, her determination unwavering. "We're not done yet," she said, "but we're getting there." She walked away, her mind already on the next day's proceedings. The finish line was still in the distance, but with each passing day, She could feel the gap closing, and she wasn't about to let up now. As the fifth day of the trial began, the air in the courtroom felt heavier. Both sides understood that the case was reaching its most critical phase. For Amara Daniels, the pressure was immense, but she carried herself with the same calm confidence she'd shown from the start. Her strategy was clear. Today, she would challenge the defense in a way that left no doubt about their wrongdoing. The first witness to take the stand was a former employee of the defendant's company, a man named Carl Peterson. He had worked in middle management for years before leaving the company due to what he called ethical concerns. Amara had fought hard to secure his testimony, and now it was time to see if it would make the impact she needed. Carl looked nervous as he sat in the witness chair, glancing uneasily at the rows of spectators. Amara approached him with a reassuring smile. "Mr. Peterson, thank you for being here today. Can you start by telling the court about your role at the company?" Carl nodded, his voice hesitant at first. "I was a regional manager. My job was to oversee accounts in the Midwest, including small business clients like Ramirez Market. And during your time with the company," Amara continued, "did you observe any practices that you felt were unethical?" Carl hesitated, his eyes darting toward the defense table where Cross sat with his usual confident smirk. "Yes," Carl said finally. "There were directives from upper management to target small businesses for fee increases because they were less likely to fight back." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Amara pressed on, her voice steady but firm. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by targeting small businesses?" Carl cleared his throat, gaining confidence as he spoke. The company knew that small businesses didn't have the resources to challenge fee increases, so they raised fees gradually, hoping the owners wouldn't notice right away. And if anyone did complain, we were told to ignore them or give vague excuses. Amara let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "Did you ever raise concerns about these practices?" "Yes," Carl admitted. "I brought it up with my supervisor, but he said it wasn't my job to question policy. He told me to focus on maximizing revenue, no matter the cost." "Did this policy come from higher up?" Carl nodded. "Yes, it was clear from the emails and meetings. The pressure came directly from senior executives. They were more concerned about profits than fairness." Cross objected, claiming Carl's testimony was speculative, but Judge Wilkins overruled him. Amara smiled inwardly, knowing this was a turning point. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice rising slightly, "did the company ever acknowledge the harm these policies were causing to small business owners?" "No," Carl said firmly. "They didn't care. To them, small businesses were expendable. If one failed, they'd just find another to take its place." The room was silent as Carl's words sank in. Even the jurors, who had remained stoic throughout most of the trial, exchanged glances. When Cross began his cross-examination, he was as aggressive as ever. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone sharp, "you were a disgruntled employee, were you not? You left the company on bad terms." Carl didn't flinch. "I left because I couldn't keep working for a company that put profits over people." Cross smirked. "And yet, you benefited from those profits for years, didn't you?" Amara quickly objected, and Judge Wilkins sustained it. Cross tried to shake Carl's credibility, but the former employee remained calm and resolute. By the time he stepped down, it was clear that his testimony had left a mark. The second half of the day was spent reviewing internal documents that corroborated Carl's claims. Amara presented charts and memos showing how the company's profits had skyrocketed in direct correlation with their fee increases on small businesses. One particularly damning document was a presentation slide titled "Revenue Growth Opportunities." Amara displayed it on the courtroom screen, highlighting a bullet point that read, "Focus on underserved markets, low resistance, high profitability." "This," Amara said, addressing the jury, "is how the defendant views small business owners like Luis Ramirez and Maria Alvarez. Not as partners, not as people, but as opportunities to exploit." Cross objected again, accusing Amara of mischaracterizing the evidence, but Judge Wilkins allowed her to proceed. The courtroom grew tense as Amara wrapped up her presentation. "This isn't just about numbers," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "It's about the human cost of these decisions. Mr. Ramirez nearly lost his family's legacy. Mrs. Alvarez had to go into debt just to keep her bakery alive. And how many others were forced to close their doors, their voices silenced, because they didn't have the resources to fight back." As the day ended, the weight of the evidence hung over the courtroom. Even Judge Wilkins seemed less inclined to interrupt Amara, his gavel resting quietly as he watched her with a mix of curiosity and caution. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Amara, firing questions about the day's revelations. She answered calmly but firmly, always keeping the focus on her clients. Lewis caught up with her as she made her way to her car. "Do you think we're winning?" he asked, his voice filled with hope and fear. Amara paused, her gaze steady. "We're making progress," she said, "but we have to stay focused. They're going to fight back harder now." "That's what companies like this do when they're cornered." Lewis nodded, his faith in her unwavering. "Whatever happens, I'm grateful. You've already done more for us than I ever thought possible." Amara smiled, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "We're not done yet. Let's make sure they don't get away with this." The courtroom was unusually quiet as the sixth day of the trial began. It was clear that the previous day's testimony had shifted the momentum in Amara's favor. The jury appeared more attentive, their expressions thoughtful, as if they were piecing together the puzzle. Even Judge Wilkins, who had maintained a stoic and somewhat dismissive demeanor earlier in the trial, seemed more engaged. Amara knew this day would be critical. The defense would likely attempt a counterattack, trying to undo the damage caused by Carl Peterson's testimony and the damning documents she had presented. She had prepared meticulously, anticipating their moves and bracing herself for what would undoubtedly be their most aggressive tactics yet. Cross began the day with a fiery opening, addressing the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the plaintiff's case is built on emotion and speculation," he declared, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "But this is a court of law, not a theater. Let's focus on the facts." He called his first witness, a senior executive from the defendant company, Amanda Gray. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, Amanda exuded confidence as she took the stand. Cross guided her through a series of rehearsed questions, painting the company as a misunderstood entity. "Amanda," Cross began, "can you explain the rationale behind the fee adjustments that the plaintiff is challenging?" Amanda nodded, her tone smooth and professional. "The adjustments were part of a broader strategy to ensure the company's long-term sustainability. We provide essential services to thousands of clients, and these fees help us maintain the quality and reliability of those services." Cross smiled, as if her answer had already won the case. "And were these adjustments applied fairly across the board?" "Yes," Amanda replied firmly. "We have a standardized process for evaluating fees, and all clients are subject to the same criteria. There was no targeting of small businesses, as the plaintiff claims." Amara watched silently, her expression unreadable. She knew Cross was trying to shift the narrative, to make it seem as though the company's actions were reasonable and fair. But she also knew that Amanda's carefully crafted answers wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Amara rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She approached Amanda with a calm, steady gaze. "Ms. Gray," Amara began, her tone polite but firm, "you mentioned a standardized process for evaluating fees. Can you describe this process in detail?" Amanda hesitated, her confidence faltering slightly. "It involves analyzing various factors, such as market conditions, client usage patterns, and operational costs." "And who oversees this process?" "Our finance and strategy teams," Amanda replied. Amara nodded, as if considering the answer. Then, with a sudden shift in tone, she asked, "Are you familiar with this email?" She held up a printed copy of the now infamous directive to maximize revenue from small accounts. Amanda's face stiffened. "I've seen it," she admitted cautiously. Good, Amara said, her voice sharpening. Because this email explicitly instructs employees to focus on small businesses due to their low resistance. Is that part of your so-called standardized process? Cross objected, accusing Amara of badgering the witness, but Judge Wilkins overruled him. Amara pressed on. Ms. Gray, does this email reflect the company's official stance on how to handle small business clients? Amanda shifted uncomfortably. That email does not represent our official policy. But it was sent by a senior executive, Amara countered. And you admitted earlier that fee adjustments are overseen by senior management. So how can you claim this directive had no influence on your actions? Amanda struggled to respond, her composure cracking under Amara's relentless questioning. By the time Amara finished, it was clear that the jury's confidence in the defense had been shaken. The afternoon brought another dramatic moment when Amara called an economist to the stand. The expert explained in simple terms how the defendant's fee hikes disproportionately affected small businesses, forcing them into a cycle of debt and financial instability. Charts and graphs illustrated the devastating impact, driving the point home with undeniable clarity. The jury leaned forward, their attention fixed on the screen as the economist detailed how the company's practices enriched its executives, while pushing small businesses to the brink. Even Judge Wilkins seemed moved, his usual stern expression softening as he listened. When the court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was electric. Spectators whispered among themselves, and reporters scrambled to update their headlines. Amara gathered her notes, her mind already on the final day of the trial. Lewis approached her in the hallway, his eyes shining with a mix of hope and disbelief. "You're amazing," he said. "I don't know how you do it." Amara smiled, though her exhaustion was evident. "It's not over yet," she said. "They're going to come at us hard tomorrow. We need to be ready." Lewis nodded, his faith in her unshaken. "Whatever happens, I know you've done everything you can. We all do." Amara walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the case pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't let it deter her. She had fought too hard and come too far to falter now. Tomorrow would be the final battle, and she was ready to give it everything she had. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the city, Amara sat alone in her office, reviewing her notes one last time. The journey had been grueling, but she knew that justice was within reach, and she wasn't about to let her clients, or herself, down. The courtroom was tense as the final day of the trial began. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with more people standing along the back wall. Reporters whispered to one another, their cameras ready to capture the conclusion of what had become a highly publicized case. Amara entered with her usual calm composure, but there was an unshakable determination in her eyes. She had spent the night preparing, knowing that today was her chance to deliver the final blow. Judge Wilkins called the court to order, his gavel echoing in the packed room. The defense was set to make its closing arguments, and Cross appeared confident as he strode to the front of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "you have heard a lot of accusations this week. You've seen documents and heard testimonies, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. My client is a pillar of the business community, providing valuable services to thousands of people. Mistakes may have been made, but those mistakes do not equate to intentional harm." Cross paced as he spoke, weaving a narrative about a well-meaning company misunderstood by the plaintiff. He emphasized the complexity of corporate decisions and the need for businesses to adapt to economic challenges. By the time he finished, his tone was almost pleading, as though asking the jury to forgive the company for its supposed lapses. Amara watched silently, her face unreadable. When Cross returned to his seat, she rose and walked to the front of the courtroom. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began her closing argument. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Amara said, her voice steady and clear, "this case is not about complexity. It is about choice. The defendant made a deliberate choice to exploit small businesses, the backbone of our economy, for their own gain. They didn't just make mistakes. They made decisions that harmed people like Luis Rivera, who trusted them to act fairly. Amara paused, letting her words sink in. She walked slowly toward the jury box, her eyes meeting each juror's gaze. You've seen the evidence. The email instructing employees to target small businesses. The testimony from Carl Peterson, who confirmed the company's true motives. And you've heard from an expert who explained how these predatory practices have devastated countless lives. This is not a misunderstanding. It is a pattern of behavior driven by greed. Her tone softened as she continued, adding a personal touch. Luis Rivera came to this country with nothing but hope and determination. He built his business from the ground up, working tirelessly to support his family. And when he turned to the defendant for support, they saw an opportunity to exploit him. Luis is not just a victim. He is a symbol of resilience and courage, standing up to a giant that thought it was untouchable. Amara turned back to the gallery, gesturing toward the spectators. And Luis is not alone. Behind him are countless others who've suffered in silence, too afraid to fight back. This case is about justice, not just for Luis, but for everyone who's ever been taken advantage of by those with power. The jury's expressions shifted, their focus entirely on Amara. She had captured their attention, and more importantly, their emotions. Amara concluded with a powerful statement. You have the power to send a message today, that no one is above accountability, no matter how wealthy or powerful they may be. Justice is not just a concept, it's an action. And I trust you to take that action. She returned to her seat, the courtroom silent except for the faint sound of pens scratching as jurors took notes. Cross shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier confidence fading. The jury deliberated for hours, and the wait was agonizing. Luis and his family sat in a corner, holding hands and whispering prayers. Amara stayed close, offering quiet reassurance even as she fought her own nerves. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson handed the verdict to Judge Wilkins, who read it silently before addressing the court. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, he announced, his voice calm but firm. The defendant is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $2.5 million. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Luis broke down in tears, his family embracing him tightly. The gallery erupted into applause, and even Judge Wilkins allowed a rare smile to flicker across his face before calling for order. Amara remained composed, though a deep sense of relief washed over her. She turned to Luis, her voice steady. We did it. You did it. Luis could hardly speak, his gratitude overwhelming. Thank you, he whispered. You didn't just fight for me. You fought for all of us. As the court adjourned, reporters crowded around Amara, asking how she felt about the victory. She answered with grace, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. Later that evening, as Amara returned to her office, she found a letter waiting for her. It was from Judge Wilkins. Opening it, she read his handwritten note. You have my respect. Few lawyers have the skill, integrity, and courage you've shown in this trial. Keep fighting for justice. Our profession needs people like you. Amara smiled, folding the letter carefully. This victory was just the beginning. She knew there were many more battles ahead, but she was ready. The world might underestimate her, but she had proven that she was a force to be reckoned with, and she would continue to fight for Luis, for justice, and for those who needed a voice.